Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about The Bedlam Stacks by Natasha Pulley. And holy hells, this book did something to me. I desperately want to reread it once it's settled a bit in my soul. I want to write a dissertation on it. I want to never look at it again too closely for fear of ruining the magic. I want to gnaw on it like it's a bone that I'm trying to get to the marrow. This book just thrust itself into my all-time favorites list without any word from me. And I want to say, all I really want to say about it is, I love it. But I'm going to try to make words happen about it as well. The Bedlam Stacks follows Merrick Tremaine, a gardener, a smuggler, a nobleman, a poor man, a strong man, who has lost his health when he lost most of the use of one of his legs. He used to work for the East India Company, and when they contact him about making an expedition to the interior of Peru to smuggle out some desperately needed trees that produce quinine, the cure for malaria, he initially is sure he cannot go. He can barely walk. But when his friend Clem shows up to talk him into it, Merrick relents. Clem has a plan that will take them most of the way by horse, and Merrick is necessary. He knows how to make the cuttings that will be needed, but also he knows how to keep the samples alive, and unlike everyone else, he actually has a connection to this very specific region of Peru. His grandfather had spent a lot of time there, so much so that his father was actually born there in this little town called New Bethlehem. His connection might help them find the trees, but more importantly, it will give them an excuse to be there that won't reveal their real purpose. Because the people who control the quinine monopoly, if they figure out why this expedition is going there, yeah, it will mean not just their death, but possibly the death of a hell of a lot more people. And doesn't that sound like the classic adventure book? Like one of those 19th century stories about Englishmen fighting their way through the great South American jungles single-handedly, ignoring the troop of people who are actually there helping them. Because, yeah, that's sort of what this book is, but it's also so much more. And I love the concept of those old adventure stories, but I can rarely get through them because they are always, let's be 100% honest here, love letters to colonialism. And this book definitely acknowledges the history of the genre, but it also turns it on its head and examines it. So first of all, I do want to talk about the prose because, oh my god, the fucking prose. It is so beautiful. Like, I am a reader that, yeah, I notice beautiful prose, I can talk about it, I love sitting back and examining how it works, but you will never convince me to pick up a book just on the prose alone. Honestly, sometimes I'm turned off by beautiful prose because so often books that are very, very prosy, it becomes about the language and the language alone. And at the core, I'm a story-based reader and a character-based reader. Like, that's what I care about. I will fight you to the death if you say story and character do not matter. And a lot of the times that really focus on the prose, they also end up feeling a little bit pretentious. But this book had the playfulness, the painting of a picture, and the utility of the beautiful prose down pat. There were beautiful metaphors, elegant rhythms, introspective moments, complex descriptions that drew our eye to things that don't literally matter to the story, but really matter to the themes. But while it has all these beautiful, poetic elements, it never felt like it was at the expense of introducing us to interesting people who are going on interesting adventures. It felt like it was part and parcel with the rest of the story. And one of my absolute favorite things about the prose in this book was the fact that a lot of what makes it so special is the sentence structure and rhythm is just off from the norm. Clauses appear in places that are not grammatically incorrect, but are jarring. A lot of the filler words that we, pepper our speech with, they're just left out of sentences that are otherwise super complex, and it all comes together to give the reader pause. It ends up feeling lush, but sparse at the same time, which very much fits our main character and our POV character and the world of the book to a T. But also, a good example, page 3, the first actual page of text here. In its bell jar, which kept damp from the mechanisms, the clock thunked around to 7:20. That sentence is so simple, but there's just something vaguely it's unusual where the clause is. It's unusual the lack of the word "the" before "damp." Like, there's a lot of little things about it that just cause you to pause to parse it out. The way the sentence is organized just requires you to stop, let it settle, examine it from different angles before you figure out what it's literally telling you. And the book does this multiple times a page on purpose. Like, the complexity of the language is used in moments that the author clearly wants us to slow down and settle into the scene. And in contrast, the language simplifies when it's time for the story to move more swiftly, or even downright abruptly, which is all so fucking perfect for a book that is at its core about how we exist in and almost in opposition to time. And yeah, this book, there's a beautiful suddenness to a lot of what's going on in this book as well. There are these moments of violence, of action, of big emotions that we get not really even the tiniest bit of foreshadowing that they're coming. Like, you get they're set up that it's not coming out of the blue, as it were. Like, it makes sense in the story, but there's nothing in the language or the precursing scene to make you go, okay, this is about to happen. And more than that, they are in direct contrast to the tone of the scene around them. And it all feels so real and so visceral. Because while I think that we all like to imagine that we do see big moments of our life coming, we usually don't. They are things that impact us heavily, that come out of the blue. And the starkness of these moments are so perfect in this book. One of my favorites is a moment of violence, and the precursing scene is all describing the beauty of like the visual aspects around them. There's a lot of slow introspective description, and then suddenly out of the blue it's violence. But there's also an explosion, a death, a loss, and even love that makes perfect sense in the narrative. It fits the story as we're being told, but it just appears in a moment that you don't expect it to. And the language in the book is used to really recreate that feeling of suddenness from life so perfectly. Also, I cannot get over how silence is used in this book, and specifically the silence of characters. There's one character in particular that just doesn't speak much, but he is still intensely expressive, but in incredibly subtle ways. And I'm so jealous, because this is a type of character I have tried to write so many times, and I don't think I've ever accomplished it. When I try to write an exceptionally closed-off character, I end up falling back almost exclusively on phrases like, he gave her a look that said that he wasn't going to answer, or she raised her eyebrows in disdain, over and over and over again. And the beauty of what Natasha Pulley did with this is she shifted the attention. Like, yes, the narrative directly tells us he shifted his shoulder, but she doesn't try to explain in that moment what it means. Instead, we get these small emotive gestures, and then we see Merrick's response to those gestures, which tells us what the gesture actually meant. And it is so perfectly done! And I also even love the fact that when the characters first meet, when they are first introduced to each other, and Merrick does not know this exceptionally closed-off, quiet character, there are a lot of these little gestures, actions, and tones that Merrick sees but cannot interpret. And so we as readers don't really get any interpretation of them, and therefore we are left in the dark about what they mean. And it feels a bit confusing when it's happening, but it's also so real and so alive. And it also gives us this beautiful clue into Merrick's character as well. The fact that he is able to interpret these things and able to read this really quiet person is the thing that really opened his character up for me, because Merrick is hard as hell at the beginning of the book to get a grasp on. He seems old but young, he seems empathetic yet apathetic, he feels like the classic soft, sensitive boy, but there's hints of violence in the air around him. He's a gardener who worked for years smuggling opium into China. He worked for the East India Company, which I will say, I'm not sure I have ever read anything written after the 20th century that doesn't put the East India Company in a position of straight up evil as hell villain. because the organization was pretty fucking terrible. And like in this book, why they want Merrick in to get the quinine producing trees is because the opium plantations in the colonized India are overrun with malaria. And that's like 17 layers of terrible. The colonization of India was terrible. Forcing people to work on opium plantations is terrible. The opium trade itself is terrible. The forcing of China and Japan to open trade with England by using military might is all terrible. And Merrick is wrapped up in all of it. And he is dragged along in this. And there is that feeling of, yeah, if I don't do it this way, it will get even worse the other way. But some of his actions, the fact that he's involved in this, feels like such a contrast to the kind, understanding person that he comes across as. He is deeply empathetic on a personal level, but is just not letting these terrible things, he's just letting these terrible things happen on a larger scale. And not just that, but he's also sort of part of it happening. And a lot of it feels like he's being dragged along and doesn't think he has the ability to stop it, but you still sort of cannot help yourself from looking at him going, you're the main character of this book. You're in a position to do something about it. And then there's this passage on page 213. Of course you'll go. You must. People are like bees. They're all workers who could be queens with the right stuff, but once a queen making has begun, it can't be reversed. A bee that's halfway a queen can't turn back into a worker. She'd starve. She must keep growing, and then she must leave. And Merrick, as we meet him, is halfway to being a leader, but has stagnated. He's stopped growing. He saw the world, saw the humanity in people, saw the horrors of what's going on, learned the skills he needed to make big changes, and then just stopped. He's a kind-hearted action adventurer who quite suddenly had his power to do anything, or at least his perception of his power to do anything, taken away from him. And not just because the injury to his leg has given him a permanent limp, he can barely walk, though he repeatedly says he cannot walk, and then he walks. And yes, there is the physical disability there, but there's also clearly a lot going on with what version he saw of himself and where he sees himself now. And basically, he let people tell him he's no longer capable of doing anything except for returning to be the disliked younger brother on a failing estate. And he keeps wanting to step forward into a position of leadership, but people keep telling him he can't, and he just lets them. And it all makes sense with who he is becoming. But one of the first signs of who he really is that ability he has to read people, and to do it so much better than anyone else around him. And specifically his ability to read Raphael is just so easy for him compared to everybody else. But we also see him reading the other characters so impeccably well. And one of the things I love about it is he likes them. And, like, it's clear the narrative wants us to like them. But also, Merrick can see what's underneath. He sees and accepts their flaws, and there are these wonderfully weird little moments where we're seeing all these beautiful, likable traits, and then there's just something dropped that you're like, oh, that's horrible. Oh, and Merrick does not deny it in the least. He's like, yeah, that's horrible. And he still is friends with them and still sees the good in them, but doesn't really... I don't know. There's just something about the way he interacts with the horrors of other humans that is so unusual. The book also uses the theme of translation to talk about not just language, but also culture, about how it's really more about understanding the ways humans are human, no matter what the culture is, but also just accepting the differences without trying to dissect them. And there's this lack of moral judgment in his point of view that is just fascinating. And, like, it's throughout the entire book that he has this weird lack of moral judgment. And when we finally do get to see him making the moral judgment, like, it feels like it's been needed all along, and when it comes, it is so strong and so fascinating. But the world presented in this book is inherently morally gray. Like, there are a lot of bad things here, and there's a certain acceptance that none of the characters can magically make these horrible things go away. They are just trying to do the least harm possible. And we see it so clearly through Merrick, who does see the bad in people, does see the bad in the systems, and just does his best with what's there. He mourns the loss of the good and fights for what he can. And in the end, yes, his stepping into the role of Queen Bee, as it were, is to do the things he can. And to work within a system that is inherently flawed, but to try to do something with it. And it's just, it really hit me in this moment. In January of 2025, there was a lot in this book that felt emotively right to me. But I do also want to talk about the colonialism thing. This book exists in a world that is both historically and narratively in this version of the world heavily colonized and heavily colonialist. And it doesn't hand wave any of it away. Like, our attention is constantly drawn to the English and the Spanish marching into places that they should not own and just demanding the locals do things their way without really acknowledging or understanding the culture that they are stomping down. And the book is very aware of the difference in understanding people and really seeing them as human, but also how colonialism separates people from their past. A lot of the book takes place in a town whose culture remembers the pre-Columbian culture, but has been largely overwritten by the Spanish colonizers' culture. And the church that is a real thing that's built on the Temple of Cuzo is brought up numerous times. And it's brought up in a literal sense and a more metaphorical sense, and the fact that it's not just built on top of the existing structure, but its foundations are carved into the rock below that the Incan people would have never disturbed. It's all just a perfect image for these people in this colonized world. But it also uses the concept of colonialization and how colonization affects people to talk about time. How we move through time always remembering and building on our past, but unable to go there. The tragedy of being out of sync with time. The glory of being in the right place at the right time. How immortality is frozen, but unable to connect with the ever-changing world around it. And it's all just so beautifully painted. And I'm trying my best not to just sit here and write an essay about how all these things interact and what the book is trying to say, because this is supposed to be a book review, not a dissertation on the book. But I will say it's doing some really interesting things with time, colonialism, and humanity. And also, on the note of time, yes, the book is not a sequel to The Watchmaker of Filigree Street or The Lost Future of Pepper Harrow, but Kitamori does make an appearance in this book. And he brings another really interesting layer to the conversation on time as someone who remembers the future and so is facing the other direction as everyone else. And he sort of does connect with Merrick, because Merrick himself is set up as a perfect match for Raphael, even in the very beginning of the book, though you don't really notice it in the beginning, or at least I didn't really notice it. And it's not just because he's heard stories from his childhood of this world and knows a lot more about it than most everybody else and has that innate connection culturally, but also there's a part of Merrick that himself feels outside of time. He has bits of his past locked away in his mind that come back sometimes and don't come back other times. He thinks about how time slips away on long voyages. He himself has a really interesting relationship with time. He feels prematurely aged. And there's a lot of interesting things with him and time, which makes him the perfect match for Raphael. And I don't want to go into too many details here because I really don't want to spoil this book, and yeah, there's a lot about this book that I can't really talk about in depth without spoiling it. But I love their relationship. I do feel like I need to warn you, if you're going into this book looking for a full-out romance, you're not gonna find it. It's very clear that these two characters do feel very deeply for each other, and there's enough implication here that I'd feel pretty safe saying, yes, it is some form of romantic love between them, but there's a moment where I can really only describe as cuddling, a couple of moments actually. It's very clear that the people around them are fully aware of how they feel about each other, but, like, there's no kissing. There's not even an implication of a fade to black love scene. There's really no implication that there ever will be anything sexual or romantic between them. And it's just not really what the book is doing. But at the same time, it is a love story. which makes me tempted to say it's an ace love story, but we don't really know that. It's just sort of that we're separated from them. We don't know if they have any real, like, sexual feelings for each other. But oh my god, this is not a spoiler, it's just a split second of a moment near the end, and it's so gorgeous. There's a moment with one of the stone people and a skeleton, and it's presented as a moment of almost obscene intimacy rather than horror, and that was such a clear vision into how Merrick is feeling, and it was just so beautiful and so gorgeous, and But I do need to talk about the world building here as well. We spend a good portion of this book in Peru in 1859, and the magic parts of this world are based on pre-Columbian Peruvian mythology and culture. And I'll say right away, I don't know enough about it to tell you whether or not it's accurate to real history or anything like that. I know just enough to sort of recognize things here and there, but that's about it. But I will say that if you look at it just as a fantasy book, this world is fucking delicious. It's full of things that feel like the kind of amazing that could exist in our world, things that brush up against the border between reality and magic, and things that take us wildly over the border into just pure fantasy land. It feels dreamlike, but deeply entrenched in waking logic. Until you sort of drift off and we go into a place that feels a lot more just pure magic. And the whitewood trees, the fallen ruin, the exploding ducks, all of it felt like the kind of dream that feels so real you expect to wake up to that reality. It felt whimsical, and it felt like, I will admit this analogy comes to me because snowstorm in New Orleans, but it felt like walking through New Orleans in a snowstorm. And it also feels like it's leading to a future that would be even more steampunky magical than the one we actually see in this book. And I don't know, y'all, there's just so much more to talk about with this book. The themes of loneliness, insanity, being othered, disability. I haven't touched at all on Mina or Clem. Like, I mentioned Clem, but I haven't really touched on what the hell's happening with him in this book. The relationship between Raphael and Martel is fascinating, and I haven't touched on it. I think I could write a dissertation or 5 on this book, but I tried to keep my reviews to 4 pages written out, and this is already halfway down the 5th one, and I'm talking really fast, but I suspect this is going to be a long review. So I'm going to stop here and say this book was fucking magic. I don't think it's necessarily for every reader. I do think there are some people who might be turned off by the style of prose. I do also think that there are some people who might not want to read a book about colonialism that is going to, you know, touch on racism here and there. But I love this book so much that I want to swim in it. I loved it so much that I had to pick up another book immediately, or I would not have slept after finishing it. And I still did spend like 2 hours just laying there daydreaming, maybe literally dreaming about this book. This book is going to live in my soul for quite a while. So yeah, if you like fantasy that has a slightly more, just a little bit of a high-end prose style that has a lot to say about colonialism and reality and time, and has implications of a gay romance, though there's not a straight-out romance in this book, then yeah, I 100% recommend The Bedlam Stacks by Natasha Pulley.